valuable speaker. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Mehmet Asutay for accepting our invitation. Professor Asutay, welcome to the webinar.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Actually, before going to our question, yes, I know most probably all of you know about Mehmet Asutay, but I want to just briefly introduce Mehmet Asutay as a tradition of our webinar series. Mehmet Asutay is a professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic political economy and finance at Durham University Business School, and the director of Durham Center in Islamic Economics and Finance, as well as program director of Islamic Finance Master Programs. Mehmet's teaching, research, publication, and supervision of research is all in Islamic moral economy, Islamic economics, Islamic finance and banking, Islamic political economy, Islamic governance and management, and the Middle Eastern political economics. His articles on his research interests have appeared in various international academic journals and professional magazines. He has also published manuscripts and edited books on aspects of Islamic moral economy and Islamic finance. The latest of which some of example are like a model for Islamic economic development, an approach in Islamic moral economy, mapping the risk and risk management practices in Islamic banking. Professor Asutay's recent research includes the construction of Islamic moral economy and Islamic political economy, and their articulation in economic and sustainable development. In addition, his research focused on locating Islamic banking and finance within the expressed ideals of Islamic moral economy by essentialization, sharing, and collaborative economy nature of Islamic finance. And professors is also involved in empirical research in various aspects and dynamics of Islamic banking and finance, as well as examining the political economy, determinants and consequences of various Islamic finance, industry, and development models. Mehmet is the editor of chief of the American Journal of Islamic and Society in the International Journal of Islamic Economics and Finance Studies and the Review of Islamic Economics. Mehmet is also a board member of the International Association of Islamic Economics. Yes, maybe there are some missing parts. Sorry for apologizing for.
Thank you. It's more than enough. Thank you.
Because it's a bit short and brief summary, and when considering your background, Professor Asutay. Today, we will talk and discuss the current situation and the future of Islamic finance and meaning of Islamic finance for global financial markets with Professor Asutay. I will not be actually continue like that because I can imagine that everyone is looking forward to going to the topics. Therefore, Mr. Asutay, with your permission, I would like to jump into my questions, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please go ahead. It's good to be here.
Yeah. First of all, I think we can start with your take-up on Islamic moral economy. What is it, and why Islamic moral economy when we are considering the definition and differences from the others?
Thank you very much. Of course, this is a very often question that I get on why Islamic moral economy, despite the fact that the literature mainly articulated as Islamic economics. I think this is very much related with how we perceive economics or economy as such. Because economics, by definition, is a product of Enlightenment philosophy that provides a particular definition of what human is and how human can be located within the universe, and the articulation of that in economy, society, politics, and etc. And looking at that definition, and therefore economics as a term directly relates to that definition. However, Islam, through the notion of, or the terminology of iqtisad, has a particular take-up. When we look at the definition of iqtisad as expressed in Arabic, as compared to economics that we use, there's huge differences in terms of worldviews and the articulation of those worldviews. Economics directly relates to efficiency and maximizing, and whether utility maximizing or profit maximization, whatever, but the main objective function is maximization, and human, a particular human definition, a rational individual who tries to maximize. However, within the iqtisad definition, when we look at the objective function is entirely different, because it refers to justice, and working towards justice and giving the right of everything to everything and everyone, as well as establishing equilibrium in the society. On the one hand, equilibrium world of Islam, as opposed to maximizing an efficiency world of economics. So looking at from that perspective, Islamic economics terminology will be eclectic, because economics refers to a particular worldview, and Islam, on the other hand, entirely different worldview. And bringing together as Islamic economics, perhaps in everyday language, we might get away with it, but when we look at the meaning and the articulation of those meanings, I think it refers to an eclectic approach. Of course, that eclectic approach is a product of 1960s Cold War period. The emergence, in the emergence, you didn't have the expanded intellectual capabilities as well as connectivity to the past compared to today, and therefore Islamization of knowledge process led to the usage of Islamic economics rather than coming up with an authentic definition. In other words, it's very much the reflective of a response to Weberian understanding that we have economics, and this is the Islamic version. However, in order to constitute that in an authentic sense, we have to look at the concepts and their definitions within the Islamic ontological articulation. And when we look at from that perspective, it is very much a moral economy. We identify a moral economy. And that moral economy, one, from the definition of iqtisad, and importantly, of course, how we understand economy. Within this understanding, economy is a product of Islamic value system, how the Islamic value system defines all the concepts around us, including human and human objectives, and also produces the necessary norms through which produces its own institutions. So when we look at from that perspective, every ontology, one way or another, will produce a particular economy understanding. When we look at one, of course, the norms, values and norms articulated in the Quran, and then the experience during the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the following periods directly suggest that the economy that was operating in those societies in line with the value system articulated in the Quran are very much a product of that ontology, and hence is an embedded reality. In other words, economy is not an additional layer on top of the existing social formation of the society, but it emerges within the value system of that society. And in particular, when we look at, for instance, the experience of Medinan market, of course, Professor Kalek contributed a lot in our understanding of Medina market. What we see, a new emergence, a totally new emergence. While there were other markets available in Medina, Prophet Muhammad SAW, instead, he opted to create a new market with its own value system, Islamic value system. And through that, we understand that the economy in general and institutions of economy has to be product of a particular ontology, in this case Islamic, and therefore it is not an imported or transplanted reality, but directly emerges, and therefore it's an embedded reality. As compared to economics that we have around us, it suggests a universal value and disregards the value system of other societies as a product of enlightenment and imposed on the rest of the world. And therefore it creates this embeddedness. On the one hand, the value system of society, different than the market logic that is imposed through the economics understanding. The whole idea of the end of the Fukuyama's end of history, for instance, suggests that there isn't any other way, but there is the liberal economic system, which entirely disregards the value system of its society through which it can generate different economies. In other words, from pluralism of all these economies, we ended up an imposed economic system, and that creates all this embeddedness. However, Islamic moral economy therefore directly suggests that rather than an eclectic approach, directly look into emergence of economy within the value system as a product of that particular system. And therefore, my take-up has been, rather than continue with this eclectic approach, Islam in economics suggests a particular worldview which is alien to Islam, rather directly go and locate economy within the Islamic ontology, therefore the terminology of Islamic moral economy. Of course, that creates confusion, I understand, because some people suggest that Islam by definition suggests a morality, and therefore economics by definition is moral. But of course, we have to be very cautious on the philosophical implications and articulations. When we look at through those philosophical articulations and deconstruct that process, we understand economics suggests entirely something different, despite the fact that you try to Islamize that. And therefore, in order to avoid that eclectic approach, you might take up on Islamic moral economy.
Thanks so much, Professor Asutay. Actually, it's a very informative approach from Islamic moral economics. Yes, everybody right now is trying to somehow make a definition about Islamic economics, but personally, actually, I am very warm to the Islamic moral economics definition. Thanks so much for that explanation. Actually, when we look at that Islamic discourse, yes, after Islamic discourse, we found some institution to implementation of that actually discourse. When we look at actually the important institution in economic side, we observe that banking is very important. So how do you evaluate from Islamic economics discourse to the Islamic banking? How can we actually make actually analysis and evaluation about that Islamic banking?
Although, of course, there have been quite a number of attempts to locate banking and try to trace the origin of banking to the Muslim world. But we have to be honest with each other, and banking is a product of a Western experience. Because by the nature, the economy evolved in the West, as Polanyi would suggest, when the great transformation was happening, when the disembeddedness were happening, when the market economy was emerging as opposed to moral economy in the West as well. The institutions, new institutions accordingly emerge in relation to this new ontological formation after the Industrial Revolution. And therefore, capital accumulation became the sources of wealth creation. Because until then, the sources of wealth creation was mainly expressed through labor. When we look at the classical Islamic writings as well, the value theory, what we call the value, because in order to define a political economy, you need to have a value theory, how you constitute value. You need to have a modes of production how you brings the factors of production together, and the distribution theory, who gets what from the production. So when we look at through value theory, modes of production and distribution theory, in the Muslim world, there was no need, because the value theory was based on labor. Labor was the essence of creating wealth. When you look at, for instance, Ibn Khaldun, but as well as other classical authors, you would see labor as the source of value production. And that was traditionally in the West as well, until the emergence of this new ontology enlightenment, later the Industrial Revolution, and hence the value theory shifted from labor into capital. So then the capital perceived to be the sources of value creation and the wealth creation, and the movement of that capital became important, and therefore bank is a result of that orientation, the change in the political economy. In the Muslim societies, however, bank therefore did not emerge, because they insisted against the enlightenment understanding of what human is and how that human is located, what is the objective function. The Muslim world rejected, in a way, such definitions, and therefore remained within its moral economy. And therefore, the emergence of capital as a source of value creation did not take place historically in the Muslim societies, and therefore there wasn't a need for an institution such a bank to facilitate capital movements. And therefore, when we look at the whole prohibition of interest in the Quran, for instance, is not only in terms of fiqh to facilitate the process of capital movement, but it directly provides a definition of what capital is. And therefore, perhaps in the modern time, in the modern times within the nation states, when we look at the whole reconstituting of economic system, of course, either because of the colonial implications or because of westernizations, the institutions as well as the system of economy, in other words, capitalism mostly, was taken as the political economy. And therefore, the institutions of that political economy transplanted in the Muslim world to produce certain outcomes in a similar way to regenerate capitalism within the Muslim everyday life. However, historically, you didn't have that, and therefore it's a transplantation. Until, of course, 1960s, 70s, the impact of Islam was not seen in the public sphere in the Muslim world, because the new Muslim nation states mostly established on secular lines. But in later years, we see the emergence of Islamic identity search. And that identity search, we understand, mainly, of course, with some of the new nation states, such as Pakistan, being established as Muslim, and therefore search for institutions. Of course, the historical roots of most of those institutions were not there, such as banking, in order to mobilize the resources for economic development. And therefore, banking was considered as an alternative, and hence how Islamic banking can be product of it. And therefore, I think it is important for us to understand within the Islamic moral economy of the past, the institution wasn't there, because riba the prohibition of riba directly relates to define what capital is. And when we look at that, riba is the definition of course, is an articulation of expropriation. Riba is prohibited because it creates expropriation, because the whole definition of capital cannot be hegemonic. However, because we were living in the capitalist economy, on the other hand, the Islamic identity search, and therefore the Islamization that I referred earlier, since 1960s, an Islamization process, how the institutions that we have created by different ontological forms can be Islamized. And therefore, Islamic banking is a product of that process. And of course, Sharia scholars, academics, policymakers, financiers involved in creating this model. When we look at the original model, either in the civil society in 1950s and 60s, certain Islamic transactions, but later in the case of Mitgam in Egypt in 1963, social credit union. But later, of course, that was converted into commercial banking in 1970s in the face of emerging capital in the Muslim world. And therefore, Islamic banking is a product of Islamization process and in the face of one, development need in the Muslim societies, two, emerging capital and capital movements necessitated certain institutional arrangement, and identity search, Islamic identity search resulted in that this capital movements has to be Islamically conducted, and hence emergence of Islamic banking. It is an amazing political economic story when we look at how different paradigms, Islamic, the Western, on the other hand, different actors, we have Sharia scholars, bankers, academics, policymakers. So that negotiation process has been an amazing process intellectually as well, facilitated by the Islamization of knowledge. Of course, I think that was very rushed and not properly established definition of what economics is or iqtisad, why iqtisad was not opted. But that was the conditions, the Cold War period, solutions were looked into, and Islamic banking as commercial banking based on murabaha came out to be the model. Of course, that was when I, in my research, when I discussed with founding fathers a lot on those issues, their suggestion was that the murabaha-based commercial banking was a short-term solution to the problems in the Muslim world, because in 1970s, you couldn't go to any leader in the Muslim world to suggest entirely alternative banking system. But it seems that that short-term solution has become the institutional forms that we have today. And somehow Islamic banking in its current form has become the end of history for us somehow.
Thank you so much, Professor. Actually, I was to ask a question about the political economy, but you already combined these two actually questions about the Islamic banking and political economic side. And before actually my next question, you may be actually adding some issues about when you are answering the next question about the political economy of Islamic banking. But the next question will be more about the expansion of Islamic finance. And when we look at the expansion of Islamic finance, we observe that there are some new countries actually offering Islamic economics, Islamic finance products, Islamic banking. And apart from that, internally, the countries which have already existing Islamic banking or Islamic institutions, their share also increasing. So the question will be around that, the expansion of Islamic finance, Islamic banking. And apart from that, there is actually, especially last 10 to 20 years, there's a disruption on financial system, including the volatility, including the crisis. But we are observing that Islamic finance and Islamic banking more resilient to when we look at that disruption. And apart from that, there are some new developments like fintech, decentralization, from fintech to blockchain. How do you feel about that? First, about that expansion of Islamic finance, and going forward, how do you feel about the future of Islamic finance?
I think we have to look at, in terms of stages, how this expansion, in other words, the political economic expansion of Islamic finance, and later, as we are seeing in the last perhaps 5 years, the disruptive nature of Islamic financial offerings, new offerings beyond Islamic banking. Because until recent times, Islamic banking remained the main offering within the Islamic finance sphere. When we look at data, still, of course, main assets of Islamic finance is still with Islamic banking. And therefore, perhaps what I call the democratization of institutional offerings are important rather than just one institutional offering, that is Islamic banking. I'm not denying the importance of Islamic banking in terms of one, providing Sharia compliant financing for those people who are concerned with the Islamic nature of their economic and the financial activities. On the other hand, mobilizing the sources. But of course, we have to consider the consequences of Islamic banking. In other words, in terms of the aspirational world, how much it is operating within the aspirational world, and how much it is closer to that world, and how much it is being embedded in the very much the capital movements only, rather than producing the outcomes that we would expect from Islamic economics, or in my terminology, Islamic moral economics. And therefore, there has been quite amount of questions on the Islamicity, or in terms of the consequences it produces. It seems that our major focus has been Sharia compliancy, but not necessarily what consequences produced by Sharia compliancy. Because under the hegemony of capital, of course, a Sharia compliant process has become a function of banking, rather than causality running from Sharia compliancy to Islamic banking. In other words, who is the determinant? Determinant should have been the Sharia compliancy process, and the determined which would be the Islamic banking transactions. But we have seen the other way around, causality. In other words, banking and finance, Islamic banks and financial institutions under the market conditions, they have certain needs to facilitate transactions, and therefore Sharia compliance process has become a facilitator of that. So the equation changed. In other words, just a simple answer that we always give, the organized tawarruk issue, Sharia Islamic Fiqh Academy, which is respected all over the world in the Muslim world, and everyone would refer to their fatwa, which gave a fatwa that the organized sukuk is haram. So if we consider that as the representation of the totality of Islamic position, as on most of the issues we do, and therefore our position should be organized tawarruk cannot be acceptable. However, majority of Islamic banks in the world, majority, not all the Islamic banks, but majority, great majority of Islamic banks in the world has been offering organized tawarruk through the Sharia compliancy process in their own bank. So therefore, individual banks, they have created their own hegemonic understanding as opposed to the totality of the Islamic Fiqh Academy. Why? Because the market conditions pressures. However, here, it doesn't consider market condition, but it looks at what the will of what the maqasid sharia, what is the maslaha, and therefore that maslaha directly suggests that no, it's not acceptable. But here, the market conditions creates a delusional maslaha, new maslahas, which are not embedded, which are not articulated. And therefore, under the market conditions, then Islamic banks have become facilitator of the need. So looking at from that perspective, the potential to legitimize practices of the existing financial system has given Islamic banking and finance the opportunity space to expand. So rather than becoming or remaining a niche area, by expanding our acceptable spheres, such as organized tawarruk, which facilitates, makes it easy to create liquidity and solve the liquidity problems. And therefore, markets then sees us as a facilitator. It sees Islamic banking and finance as a facilitator rather than an alternative. I have been teaching Islamic economics and finance for many, many years now, but any textbook as well, whenever you get a textbook on Islamic finance, when you look at definitions, the prohibition of interest, then the PLS, profit and loss sharing. So these are textbook definitions, or even any banker within Islamic banking and finance, when they give a lecture, they will start with prohibition of interest and the PLS, profit and loss sharing. But profit and loss sharing is not happening because you have moved into entirely new institutional settings, and under the market system, of course, and the market logic,
Mehmet abi, sen hocanın sesini duyabiliyor musun şu an?
I think Professor Asutay, I think connection has lost. Hocam, you are muted, I guess. Professor.
Yep, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yep. I do not know what happened. Strangely, it happened. I guess the market forces, they do not want to hear me. Okay. So therefore, our offerings have become more compliant to the market condition, and hence market has welcomed the expansion of Islamic finance. So that's an important political economic dynamic that we have to understand. But I, of course, fully join your comment on the resilience of Islamic banking and finance, which we have, of course, experienced in the global financial crisis. And then later, of course, under the COVID conditions. But one thing also important, although I join you fully in that comment, we have to look into whether the resilience is because of the internal dynamics of Islamic banking or because the macroeconomic environment has not been affected to that scale. So therefore, in other words, if during global financial crisis, for instance, luckily it didn't happen, but if the countries where Islamic finance has certain presence, if they were exposed to the similar crisis level of crisis, whether Islamic finance would have been survived in the same manner that we have experienced. And therefore, we have to look into the whether it was the salient features of Islamic finance contributed to resilience or the macroeconomic environment. This is something that we have to concern with, because rather than creating that imaginary of resilience, we have to create our institutions, Islamic banks, in such a way they should be resilient even under the difficult market conditions. Of course, when you are embedded in the market condition, that is terribly difficult. And therefore, my concern is that under the existing political economic conditions, Islamic banking, I think, exposed too much to the, in terms of its value system and principles, to the market conditions. Therefore, that resilience become volatile as well. By definition, you're operating within such an market economy. As a result of that, it is inevitable to become volatile. But despite that, expansion is happening, because in particular in the last 20 years, the Islamic identity search and certain countries which have suffered heavily with secularism, they have come to closer. They have come to closer to Islamic identity, such as Turkey and Indonesia, two largest economy within the Muslim world, within the OIC. Although the share of Islamic banking in those countries still very minimal compared to their potential, but we can see that there's this increasing trend. But also other countries, in particular after the Arab Spring, countries who were hesitant with Islamic finance, again with the Islamic identity becoming more expressed, is more easily expressed in the public sphere, Islamic finance has been possible, such as the North African countries, as well as Oman, for instance. And Oman has been more aggressive than any other country in terms of expansion. So therefore, how the political economy of Arab Spring perhaps played an important role in bringing Islamic finance. Strangely, in the last phase of expansion through the Arab Spring, it was a democratic process brought Islamic finance to the public sphere. This is something that we have to note as well, how the democratic process contributed. Again, in countries such as Turkey, with the expansion of democratic process, brought the institutionalization of Islamic finance in the country. But my one concern here, the closer the more Islamic banking and finance accepted by the regulative environment, more implications from regulated environment for Islamic finance in terms of giving up further its own ideals, being alternative, and getting closer to the definition of banking that the banking regulation authorities imposes. In other words, like our references to PLS is not happening, profit and loss sharing, because Islamic banks, through acceptance of the regulative authority, on the one hand, we are happy that Islamic banks are covered by regulative authorities. We were always looking for that regulation. On the other hand, when you accept that regulation, of course, your differences, your excesses, you have to give up, such as you have to comply with Basel criteria as well in the same way. But Basel criteria, of course, will affect your risk management, and that risk management, of course, directly will affect your offerings, such as PLS cannot be offered. And therefore, I think jurisdictions are important to consider because you have an alternative discourse. On the other hand, Basel it is not even a universal jurisdiction, is a club, but that club directly has impact on your offering and shaping your nature. And unfortunately, because regulative authority forces you to accept that, you have to give up those differences, become very much in the same line with the established market conditions. And therefore, I always felt that perhaps remaining
Professor?
mainstream, we have lost certain qualities.
Thank you so much, Professor. Actually, I will be asking question related with your joke about the market forces. When we look at the main market forces and the mainstream of the economic understanding and economic discourse of the global economy, we observe that there are actually always crises with actual cycle. We face that, but right now there is actually increasing focus on SDGs, ESGs, sustainable development goals, environmental and social goals, governmental issues, the other things. And when we look at these new cores, first of all, how do you actually feel about that trend? About there is actually research for the rehabilitation of the economics, or it's a new trend? And when thinking about the Islamic finance, do you think that what are the main common points between ESG and Islamic finance? And how do these ESGs affect Islamic economics in general, when we look at sustainability, green economy, Islamic principles like that?
I think as we have seen with COP26 as well, before that, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals by the UN, one way or another, we see the emergence of a new global morality. And that global morality, one way or another, has accepted in an implicit manner the failure of capitalism in terms of producing such negative spillovers, in particular environmental issues and climate. But unfortunately, the impact on humans still has not been very much appreciated. All the SDGs make certain references, of course, in terms of poverty-related issues. So these are the emerging new moralities, global moralities are exciting, and it is a positive development, considering that it was in late 1960s, one of the leading economists of the time has come up with the idea that the only social responsibility that corporation has is only to maximize their profits. Considering from that position to where we are now, and hence moving into stakeholding understanding is a positive development. Of course, there are certain concerns. We do not have the time to go into those issues, but at least there is this global morality emerging. However, my major concern with ESGs, of course, and mainly with the SDGs, the initial equation is not tackled with. In other words, what we are saying that let's skip the initial equation, as I defined, as I mentioned in the beginning in the first question that you raised. So the initial equation, let's keep that initial equation. In other words, capital being the hegemonic source of value creation. And let's don't touch to that equation that is given. So let's look at what consequences is produced and how we can moderate the consequences of that first equation. In other words, SDGs and ESGs, for me, it is a moderation process, moderating the consequences that has been produced in the end. It is a positive development, but it is not, I'm not sure whether I should use the word, it's not radical enough to solve the problem. In other words, as Catholic liberation theory would suggest, yes, we need to help poor, we have to support poor, but we have to ask the question why poor is poor. And that question, the initial question, has to be articulated. And therefore, we do not see capital and capital expansion, financialization as a source, considered as a source. And that debate hasn't taken place at that global level in generating this new global morality. But we are asked how we can moderate the consequences without touching that initial equation. Therefore, I'm not sure how substantial the results will be, because on the one hand, we are essentializing climate issues, environment, and the ESGs. On the other hand, the expansion financialization in the world, even commodifying carbon emission. Carbon emission is traded, or even air is commodified. So when we look at all this, how finance is still expanding its realm, and therefore it doesn't give me much confidence whether the green finance is for really green or it is making further profit out of green. So that's the question that we have to raise. And therefore, how the green finance, for instance, has to be really green, and whether if it is really green, whether the financial institutions would have any intention of involving in that. And therefore, certain skepticism, at least on my side, it is there. But in relation to Islamic banking and finance, this is an interesting turn, because I do recall that in 2007, for the first time, I raised the issue, the social failure of Islamic banking. It was very much such issues that we highlighted as early as in early part of the initial decade of this century. But of course, we were considered as radical who do not understand such matters. Banking is a different issue. Banking is not charity, and etc. But somehow, because it becomes a global morality, then we see that turn has come into Islamic banking and finance. So it is positive, perhaps, at least in terms of moderating the consequences of Islamic banking and finance, and producing certain social outcomes in the process beyond just charity, or beyond just having the energy quality in the buildings of Islamic banks complying with the expectations, but contributing to energy accessibility in different parts of the world, and of course through green energy. Such projects are important, but of course that requires the Sharia compliancy process to understand that. Our major challenge has been with the Sharia compliancy process, because they did not consider sustainability issues, green issues as important as nowadays they are coming to realization, because they thought that their job is to look at just whether the transaction is halal, but the consequences of those transactions, whether the consequences of those transactions are halal. That's the important part. In other words, fiqh limited itself with the intention, but entirely excluding consequences. However, the Tawhidi understanding, the complementarity, requires intention cannot be divorced from the consequences and vice versa. And therefore, perhaps sustainability can be sustainability, ESGs, and the green can be an important lesson for us to develop this methodological understanding and the Sharia compliance in Islamic banking and finance, to develop this complementary nature that you cannot divorce intention from the consequence. If the transaction is halal, the consequence has to be halal at the same time. So A is selling to B, yet that process is halal, but that person B, what is doing with this financing is also important for us to consider. And I think in a recent research I involved with a colleague of mine for a multinational Islamic banking institution, we noticed that still there is a resistance in the Sharia compliance process. And they perhaps Islamic bankers and finance people became more accepting sustainability, and they are moving into sustainability. But it seems that the major difficulty raised by Sharia scholars, they are more, I feel that they are more capitalist than the bankers and financiers in Islamic finance. And such as one Sharia scholar, globally known Sharia scholar, suggested that Islamic banks cannot afford ESGs and sustainability because conventional banks, they have been around and they have made a lot of money and they can afford, but Islamic banks have been around only 40 years and therefore they cannot afford. I think the Sharia compliance process have to look into the methodological understanding of what Islamic moral economy is, and therefore they have to incorporate such consequences in the process. As I mentioned, I have certain skepticism in SDGs or ESGs in terms of not tackling the initial equation, but at least bringing a new turn. But we have to see, of course, what consequences they will produce, whether it's a greenwash or not. That's something that we have to see. And I have certain concern that this commodification process hopefully will not result in greenwash, but I have certain skepticism on that. But at least it reminded Islamic finance that such social consequences are important, because the Islamic moral economy ontological base directly suggests the mizan rule, the initial equation. In the initial equation, all the stakeholders and their interests have to be considered in the process. And therefore, my reference to moral economy and the iqtisad rather than the economics, because economics only would look at maximization of profit of the corporations, but Islamic moral economy through mizan, through tawhid, directly suggests that complementarity of this, all the stakeholders in the process, not only capital and the earning of the capital, in other words, not only the shareholder value maximization, but the stakeholder value maximization, all the interest stakeholders, including other people, environment and climate, has to be taken into account. In other words, in the origin of these offerings, Islamic banking and finance, in the origin we have Islamic moral economy. That moral economy base, that paradigm is an amazing paradigm which offers that sustainability, but somehow we got very much oriented with capital movement, we forgot that, and somehow it comes from outside through ESGs and SDGs. It reminded us, but it is important, and more perhaps embedded nature exists in the discourse of Islamic moral economy, which should shape the operation of Islamic banking and finance.
Professor, actually, when we are talking about the intention and the result, yes, when we look at the products, innovation, and institution, we should be also focusing on form and substance, intention and results. Yes. Whole should be actually the Sharia compliant, whole should be like that. But when we look at the hypothetically or considering the current situation of the banks, global Islamic banks and global financial system, yes, we know as a fact, the innovation and the research, the development always done in the needs. So we know as a fact, last 20 years, there's a research on overall financial system about more sustainable, more actually resilient economic and financial system. So when considering both the existing model and ideal model of Islamic finance, do you think that Islamic finance could be an alternative to the global economics and finance system overall, or do you think that it will be just a complementary part of that existing financial system?
I think that's important for us. It reminded me something in the past when I used to look at the documents in Turkey published on Islamic finance, the formal documents, official documents. Always, each document started with the definition that participation banks are not alternative but complementary. That always reminded me the political economy of the time, because you don't want to disturb the apple carts. So that's the context, perhaps. But I'm happy to see that. I'm happy not to see that anymore in the documents published by Islamic banking industry in Turkey. Even the presentations used to have that. But it is an important question. As I mentioned in the beginning, I think it depends on how we want to shape Islamic banking and finance. As I mentioned, Islamic banking and finance now. I should say that it excites me, the whole idea. I have been researching Islamic economics and finance from my university times in Istanbul. And it's not because I'm only Muslim. Yes, I'm Muslim, and therefore certain requirements that I have to comply with. But I think the intellectual conviction, that's an important part for me, which motivates me. And that intellectual conviction suggests that there is an amazing story here, and that amazing story can produce a particular outcome that one, of course, in line with the Islamic ideals, how the society should be organized around the resources. And that's an important political economy issue, how society can be organized around the resources, and whether Islamic finance can achieve that, or whether the Islamic banking and finance we have is just the hybrid offerings within the existing system. I think, and unfortunately, out of this minority understanding that the Muslims in their own countries have, being a minority, sidelined always, and until recent times at least, I think that minority psychology has affected Islamic finance in the same way, and therefore, rather than remaining and producing an alternative proposition, we always wanted to be part of the existing system. And therefore, we wanted the country regulation, the national regulation, to be applied to Islamic finances, because we felt that we are orphans, orphans of the system. So that has, of course, as a result of that, we have converged with the existing, and with the convergence, of course, we had to give up the excesses or the particularities of Islamic banking and finance. And therefore, within the existing system, Islamic banking and finance is considered only as an operational tool in terms of moving capital within the existing system, and hence it is just an hybrid offerings within the existing system. Although in certain circles, references to Islamic financial system is made, but Islamic financial system, in order to be a system, you have to qualify. There are certain conditions that you have to qualify. But since those conditions have not been qualified, what we see Islamic finance sector within the existing system. So it is operating within the existing system, and therefore it seems that we have accepted that particular definition of being only part and parcel of the existing system. And this is my observation. Of course, I would welcome any colleague to challenge that. But on the other hand, in its origin, in its imagination, I feel that there is an amazing story. Even in the modern time, despite the Islamization process even, there's an amazing story, and that story has to come up. Of course, it's an evolving nature, and therefore in the beginning I mentioned that rather than considering this end of history, I always tell my students that this is not the end of history for us, but it is the beginning of history. I appreciate because in the modern times, it is the first institution that has come up. And strangely enough, of course, that institution, despite our misgivings of the Sharia compliance process, those Sharia compliance process have become accepted within the legal rationality of certain Western countries, such as in the United Kingdom as well. So there is somehow a movement of knowledge from the Muslim world to the Western global financial system. Of course, it is subordinated to the system, but it shows that there are certain alternatives. There is an amazing story, therefore. It is an evolving story, and we have to all work to ensure that this story comes up fully articulated and functioning to the betterment of the life of human beings. Therefore, whenever I go to an Indonesian conference, including the politicians in Indonesia, when they start conferences, they always define Islamic economics as rahmatul alamin, blessing to the humanity. And I feel that that blessing of humanity is there, but we should not continue with the process of relegating those Islamic ideals of serving the humanity, only transactions, how we can make the transactions halal, but particular outcomes that we produce, how that can be possible. And therefore, my initial recommendation has been in a recent document, the nature of governance nature of Islamic banks, the corporate governance. We have to move on from this shareholder-based understanding to stakeholder as the beginning of the initial responses for change, and therefore how by incorporating other stakeholders in the process. When I look at, for instance, the mission statements of Islamic banks, I feel so pained, even just the mission statement suggesting that how they are the amazing institutions working for the market conditions. That really bothers me in terms of aspirations of Islamic moral economy, Islamic economics, whatever we call, even not paying the necessary attention and care to identify our missions or being the first-class institution serving first-class people. That's really the beginning of the change. Perhaps we can start with looking at our mission and vision statements and how we can change the corporate governance structures to incorporate other stakeholders in the process rather than just considering the shareholder. Because this amazing story of Islamic economics and finance, as I mentioned, not only as an articulation of belief, but as an amazing articulation of intellectual base, it gives me the dynamism to go on with my passion, and hopefully we all can work together to make that possible. And therefore the importance of research and development together, banks, policymakers, but academics, researchers, professional or academic researchers, we have to put the efforts together to further this discourse to produce the outcomes that we are hoping for, inshallah.
Actually, thank you so much, Professor. We are getting very close to our end of our webinar, but there were actually other questions I prepared for you, but the time has passed very fast.
Sorry, I do talk a lot. My apologies.
No, actually, thank you so much. It was a great pleasure for us. It's Sunday, actually. After having our breakfast with our coffee, listening to you was a great pleasure for us. Sorry, most probably you didn't get your breakfast due to the time, actually, divergence between UK and Turkey. Maybe the last question, within maybe 2 to 3 minutes, since we talked about the UK, how do you feel? We know there are institutions in UK, and you are also living there. Are the investors and markets interested in Islamic finance? And how is the perception in there about the Islamic finance? It is actually the last question for you.
I think the UK public sphere is an important factor for the facilitation of Islamic finance. Unlike most of the European countries, as well as unlike most of the Muslim countries, this definition of public sphere is very flexible in the United Kingdom, which just articulates everyone should have a right in the public sphere. And therefore, through that understanding, Islamic financial offerings have been possible in the United Kingdom, and it goes back to early 1980s. Of course, even before 1980s, London has always been an important parking point of the capitals of the rich Muslims from the Muslim world, and in particular GCC. However, the demand conditions in terms of Sharia compliance, of course, resulted in providing Sharia compliant offerings for those capital owners, but also later the institutionalization of Islamic finance in the country. I think in 1990s, in particular under the Labour governments, this political will resulted in the expansion of Islamic finance offerings, certain regulative and legal changes as well, provided an opportunity space for Islamic finance offerings to expand. But as an anecdote, time is over, I know. I remember in 1990s, in a conference, the governor of the Bank of England, he always went around his one of his anecdotes from his life. He passed away, Sir Eddie George. I think it was in 1994 or 1995 in a conference. Later, I published that speech in one of my issues of my journal review of Islamic economics. He stated that when he was a young clerk in the Bank of England, the central bank, he had he had a new neighbor, and he went to visit them. Apparently, they were a young couple, Muslims, and they were very happy that they managed to buy a house on mortgage, but they were very sorry that it was not on Islamic conditions. In other words, it wasn't Sharia compliant. And they were lamenting on that, and they were really sinning because of riba involvement. And he said that he told them that he was very affected with that, apparently. And he told them that, look, you look very sincere people. You should pray, and I should become a governor of Central Bank of England, and I will make sure that that's offering is possible. And he said that they were very sincere. Apparently, their prayer has helped, and therefore I became a governor of Bank of England. And that process, I think that human touch was an important part, of course, later coupled with the political will initially under the Labour government in 1990s, and changes in such as double taxation on the mortgages and facilitatory processes. And therefore, expansion of Islamic finance institutionalization in terms of banks and financial institutions have become possible. Of course, the one retail Islamic bank, but it has not been terribly successful as we were hoping. I think that is very much related with the empowerment of the Muslim community. Muslim community is still, unfortunately, it is in the infant position in terms of their holdings, their economic empowerment. It is not the most successful community in the UK, and therefore to become a stakeholder in an Islamic bank, you need to have something. And therefore, the initial calculation that, look, you have 3 million, 4 million Muslims in the UK, that would make nearly 1 million mortgages, and there's an amazing market there. But they didn't count that a large majority of that population is not at that level of economic empowerment. But beyond that, of course, UK has become an important Islamic finance center. It is functioning very well. Of course, sukuk issuance, we have seen sovereign sukuk as well. In terms of size, of course, they were limited. But what was important, perhaps, is the political message that the UK is committed. And the sukuk issued under the conservative governments later. And that was important when the World Islamic Economic Forum happened in the UK. I think it was in 2013 or 14. And the Prime Minister of the time, Cameron, again went on the stage. I think he was more passionate on the stage compared to the Muslim leaders who were present at the program in terms of his appeal for Islamic finance, making London a center for Islamic finance. I think that was a very passionate appeal. And hopefully it is still an important offering, and London is an important center for Islamic finance. Of course, like 10 years ago, you would look into the ranking of Islamic assets in the world, and UK would always be in the first 10. But of course, now in the last 10 years, as you mentioned earlier, the offerings in different countries, including Arab Spring countries and latecomers such as Turkey and Indonesia, of course, no longer it is in the first 10 in terms of assets, but in terms of transactions happening, of course, also UK as an important legal center for any legal issues for Islamic finance. And also the education side remains an important center for offering. So UK would remain perhaps not one of the main actors, but Brexit process provided a new opportunity. Unfortunate Brexit process. I know that UK city, for instance, had communications with different institutions in Turkey as well as Indonesia in expanding joint expansion of Islamic finance offerings. UK, Turkey together. I remember a conference they organized in Turkey, London, Istanbul line emerging in Islamic finance. So there are those search as well for the post-Brexit financial rearrangement, how Islamic finance still, that shows that Islamic finance is still an important component of these new offerings. But of course, for ordinary people, it is although high street, certain high street banks, non-Islamic banks are offering certain products, but I think the major take-up would be this new turn with the sustainability, because London is an important center for ethical financing, and therefore convincing those investors into the ethical nature of Islamic finance will be interesting. But on that part, we have to move a bit, such as the United Nations Sukuk on vaccination for the eye problem in Africa, for instance. It was an amazing Sukuk offering by United Nations, but when I looked at the investor base, hardly there were any Muslim investors in that sukuk, because somehow Muslim investors after more profitability. For example, that sukuk attracted a lot of ethical investors, and therefore I think the ethical nature, and London is an important center for ethical finance and investors, and therefore I think rebranding Islamic finance as within that ethicality will bring a better customers and the investor base, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Professor. Actually, it was a great pleasure for us to listening to you for today. We have talked lots of issues, from Islamic moral discourse to Islamic banking, from SDG, ESG to other issues, and from the UK. I think if we had let's say 10 hours again, we will be doing well.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And dear participants, today was our third webinar of our Common Word of People series. I would like to thank you again for our key speakers, Professor Dr. Mehmet Asutay, and all the participants for their participation. Have a nice day. See you.
And thank you very much for having me. I'm really grateful for the opportunity, and hopefully in larger terms we can discuss more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yayını kapat.